they cannot be limited by enforced trends or bad taste. Thank you very much.
Now, Wynton said later that he wasn't talking about Miles, he wasn't talking about Herbie Hancock when he made that comment, but Wynton's a smart guy, and he's also on the record saying that he likes drums. Pretty likely he knew that he was going to be ruffling some feathers.
He's a good trumpet player, but he doesn't have anything extra.
Before there were rap beefs, there were jazz beefs, and Wynton Marsalis seemed to be at the center of many of them. Over the years, Marsalis had his share of clashes with some of the most legendary figures in jazz. It seemed Marsalis had his fair share of people he couldn't stand in the industry.
Now, Wynton said later that he wasn't talking about Miles, he wasn't talking about Herbie Hancock when he made that comment, but Wynton's a smart guy, and he's also on the record saying that he likes drums.
Now, one of the most talked about rivalries was his feud with none other than Miles Davis, one of the greatest names in jazz history. Back in the 1980s, the jazz world was buzzing about the tension between these two giants. On one side, you had Miles Davis, a revolutionary musician who had spent decades redefining jazz with his fearless experimentation and boundary-pushing style. On the other, you had Wynton Marsalis, a young prodigy whose rise to fame at just 23 years old had already made waves. Their vastly different approaches to jazz set the stage for a feud that rocked the scene.
Wynton Marsalis.
I can't say anything about Wynton.
Miles Davis was known for his wild creativity. He was all about breaking rules and exploring new sounds, especially with his electric period in the late 60s and 70s, when he dove headfirst into funk and fusion. Wynton Marsalis, however, came from a completely different mindset. Hailing from a respected jazz family in New Orleans, Marsalis was already a master of both jazz and classical music when he stepped into the spotlight. But Wynton wasn't just talented, he was opinionated. He became known as a purist, someone who believed jazz should stick to its traditional roots and avoid what he saw as unnecessary experimentation. This fundamental difference in their philosophies naturally created tension. By the time Marsalis hit the scene, Miles had already cemented his place as a legend, having revolutionized jazz multiple times with bebop, cool jazz, modal jazz, and fusion. But Wynton didn't hold back his opinions. He openly criticized the direction Miles had taken with his music, particularly his fusion era. For Wynton, this blend of jazz, funk, and rock watered down the artistry of jazz, turning it into something too commercial and disconnected from its roots. Of course, these critiques didn't sit well with Miles. He wasn't the type to take criticism lightly, especially from a younger musician who, in his eyes, still had a lot to prove. To Miles, Wynton came across as arrogant and dismissive of his contributions to the evolution of jazz.
He's a good trumpet player, but he doesn't have anything extra.
The rivalry wasn't just a private disagreement, it spilled over into the public eye. Their mutual record label, Columbia Records, even tried to play peacemaker. George Butler, Columbia's vice president, saw the potential in both musicians and hoped to bring them together. Butler encouraged Miles to reach out to Wynton, even suggesting that Miles call him on his birthday to break the ice. But Miles wasn't having it. He didn't see why he needed to cozy up to this young trumpeter, especially when Wynton had been so openly critical of him. Miles reportedly felt uneasy about how much the record label was pushing for them to connect, and he had no intention of playing along. Meanwhile, Wynton kept voicing his disapproval, not just of Miles's music, but also of his image. Miles was famous for his eccentric style, often stepping out in bold, fashion-forward outfits that turned heads. Wynton wasn't a fan. In fact, he publicly mocked Miles's wardrobe, referring to his outfits as dresses. For Miles, his style was just another extension of his creative expression. He didn't separate his music from his appearance. They were both part of his identity as an artist. Hearing Wynton dismiss this so flippantly only added fuel to the fire.
Maybe later he'll develop he'll develop another style. But as it is now, he's just.
Their rivalry reached its peak in 1986 during the Vancouver Jazz Festival. And it was one of those moments that would go down in jazz history for all the drama it created. Wynton Marsalis, along with his bandmates, including well-known musicians like Jeff Tain Watts, Robert Hurst, and Marcus Roberts, was en route to the festival when the idea to confront Miles Davis first came up. During the trip, Wynton's bandmates couldn't resist teasing him. They joked about whether he'd ever have the nerve to stand up to Miles, or if he was too intimidated by the jazz legend. The ribbing went on until Wynton, probably a little annoyed and ready to prove a point, finally said, "Fine, I'll do it." It was a bold decision, and one that would leave the jazz world buzzing for years. When they arrived at the festival, Miles was already deep into his set, delivering his signature style of experimental, electric jazz. Without any warning, Wynton decided to make his move. In the middle of Miles's performance, Wynton walked onto the stage completely uninvited. The crowd was stunned, and you could feel the tension in the room. Miles turned to see Wynton approaching and was clearly not amused. Reports say he shook his head and told Wynton to leave. But Wynton, determined to make his mark, picked up his trumpet and started playing anyway. The audience couldn't believe what they were seeing, a young jazz star interrupting one of the genre's biggest legends. Miles, never one to hold back, eventually stopped the music altogether. The room was dead silent as the two stood there on stage. After a moment of this awkward standoff, Wynton finally left. But the damage had already been done. People in the audience couldn't stop buzzing about what had just happened. Later, Miles gave his version of the incident, saying Wynton simply didn't fit in with the kind of music his band was playing that night. Miles was deep into his experimental phase, blending jazz with funk, rock, and electronic influences, miles away from the traditional jazz Wynton preferred. To Miles, Wynton's interruption wasn't a respectful tribute, but an intrusion into a completely different style of music. But what actually went down that night? Like with many infamous stories, it depends on who you ask. Wynton, for his part, remembers the events very differently. He says that when he walked onto the stage, Miles was playing an organ, and the music was so loud that he couldn't even hear what Miles was saying to him. According to Wynton, when the music finally stopped, Miles spoke to him, but didn't use any curse words or aggressive language.
Miles Davis and any of those guys, when you were younger?
I talked to everybody who was alive when I was younger.
Right.
Me and him didn't have a good relationship so much, but
Wynton insists that the story has been blown way out of proportion over the years, turning into a legend much bigger than the actual event. He also pointed out that Miles's frail physical condition at the time, due to age and health issues, made any kind of physical confrontation unlikely. Wynton joked that even if things had escalated, Miles's past boxing training wouldn't have helped much because Wynton would have looked like a bully for fighting an older, weaker man. Interestingly, Wynton also shared that he never even collected his $300 payment for that night. To him, it was just another gig, albeit a memorable one, and he seemed unbothered by the drama that followed. But Miles's friend and protege, Wallace Roney, has a completely different memory of the incident.
You definitely had to earn Miles Davis's respect, and not everybody could do that.
Roney claims he was sitting in the audience that night and saw the whole thing unfold. According to him, Miles had just finished a solo when Wynton approached and asked, "Can I sit in?" Miles, who had his back turned at first, didn't hear him right away. When he finally realized what Wynton was asking, he told him flat out, "No, get off." Roney says that Wynton didn't leave right away. Instead, he stood there and eventually started playing his trumpet, launching into an impromptu solo. Miles wasn't having it. After just one round of the song, Miles cut the music entirely and turned to Wynton, reportedly telling him in no uncertain terms, something along the lines of, "Get off my stage." The audience was divided. Some people booed Wynton for interrupting the performance, while others sided with him, thinking it was a bold and daring move. Roney says that Wynton, frustrated, muttered something like, "Fine," used a curse word, and walked off the stage. The whole night has become one of those legendary jazz stories where everyone who was there seems to remember it differently. Wynton's version paints him as a musician who was simply trying to join in and pay tribute, while Miles's side makes it clear he felt disrespected by the interruption. The truth is, it's probably somewhere in the middle. Next up, we've got Herbie Hancock, another jazz legend who found himself at odds with Wynton Marsalis. Herbie's name is synonymous with innovation in jazz, and his career has spanned everything from traditional acoustic jazz to funk, R&B, and even hip-hop. But as you can probably guess, Wynton wasn't a fan of all those genre-crossing experiments. Herbie Hancock's journey is the stuff of jazz history. Starting out as a child prodigy in classical piano, he discovered jazz in high school and quickly made a name for himself. By his early 20s, he was releasing brilliant albums and even playing alongside Miles Davis, becoming a key part of Miles's iconic Second Great Quintet. But after parting ways with Miles, Herbie took a sharp turn, pioneering the funk fusion sound of the 1970s. Albums like Headhunters became game changers, blending jazz with funk rhythms, synthesizers, and grooves that had crossover appeal. Now, while Herbie was charting this new path, Wynton Marsalis, much younger and part of the emerging Young Lions movement, was making waves in the 1980s jazz scene. The Young Lions were a group of musicians dedicated to reviving the classic sounds of bebop and hard bop, the jazz styles that had dominated the 1950s and 60s. For them, funk, fusion, and rock influences were distractions from the purity of jazz. Wynton and Herbie shared some history. Early on, Wynton had even performed Herbie's compositions, showing respect for his work. But their philosophies couldn't have been more different. Herbie embraced evolution in music, while Wynton championed tradition. This ideological clash set the stage for a moment of drama that jazz fans still talk about: the 26th Annual Grammy Awards in February 1984. That year was huge for Wynton. At just 22 years old, he was already a sensation, and his talent earned him 2 Grammy wins that night, one for Best Solo Jazz Performance and another for Best Solo Classical Performance. It was a massive achievement, cementing his reputation as a rare talent who could excel in both jazz and classical music. Herbie was also a winner that evening, but in a completely different lane. He snagged the Grammy for Best R&B Performance for his track Rocket. Now, if you're not familiar, Rocket isn't jazz. It's a funky, synthesized blend of hip-hop and pop that was miles away from Herbie's earlier jazz work. The track, built on drum machines and synths, was groundbreaking in its own right. Its music video was equally revolutionary, becoming one of the first by a black artist, alongside Michael Jackson's Thriller, to break into heavy rotation on MTV. This was a big deal, opening doors for more black artists to get airtime on the network. But back to Wynton. During his Grammy acceptance speech, Wynton made a statement that turned heads. He thanked jazz icons like Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, and Louis Armstrong, saying they had given an art form to the American people that cannot be limited by enforced trends or bad taste.
They cannot be limited by enforced trends or bad taste. Thank you very much.
And just like that, the room erupted into speculation. Was Wynton throwing shade at Herbie Hancock and Rocket? Or was he taking a jab at Miles Davis, who had recently released funk-influenced albums? Wynton didn't name names, but his words felt pointed. The phrase bad taste hung in the air, fueling debate in the jazz community. Miles Davis definitely thought the comment was aimed at him. Never one to hold back, Miles responded, saying, "He sounded to me like he's supposed to be the savior of jazz. Sometimes people speak as though someone asked them a question. Well, nobody asked him a question." Classic Miles, right? Herbie, on the other hand, stayed quiet publicly, but his fans weren't so forgiving. They saw Wynton's remarks as a slight against Rocket and everything Herbie had accomplished by pushing the boundaries of jazz. Wynton, of course, denied that he was targeting anyone specifically. He later said his comments weren't directed at Miles or Herbie. But let's be real. Wynton is a smart guy, and he's openly admitted that he enjoys stirring the pot. It's hard to believe he didn't know exactly how his words would be received. Wynton Marsalis versus Herbie Hancock, the Musician Magazine showdown, fast forward a year, And things between Wynton Marsalis and Herbie Hancock came to a head in a joint interview for Musician magazine. This wasn't just a casual chat, it was a face-to-face meeting between two jazz heavyweights who couldn't have more different views on music. From the jump, the conversation got spicy, with both legends diving into the Grammy drama and their broader disagreements. Early in the interview, Herbie didn't waste any time bringing up Wynton's infamous Grammy speech. "I have to congratulate you on that," Herbie said with just a touch of sarcasm. "You implied that there was good music and music that was in bad taste, and everyone wondered, what music is he referring to?" Wynton, ever ready to defend himself, replied, "The only statement I made was that we're trying to elevate pop music to the level of art. Not just in music, but pop culture, pop anything. I have nothing against pop music. Just understand what the music's about, because the purpose and function of pop music is totally different from jazz." And with that, the gloves were off. As the interview went on, Wynton elaborated on his views, doubling down on the divide he saw between pop music and jazz. "To me, what pop music is trying to do is totally different," he said. "It's really geared toward a whole bass type of sexual thing. I listen to the radio. I know the tunes they have out now. It's low-level realizations of sex." Herbie, always calm but ready to challenge Wynton, pushed back. "It's not like that, Wynton. If it were, it would just stay the same. Why would the music change?" Wynton shot back, "Because they get new computers." It was classic Wynton, sharp and unfiltered, with a touch of humor. But Herbie wasn't letting him off the hook that easily. Later in the conversation, he explained his more inclusive philosophy about music. "When we've got life, we've got music. Music can be manifest in many forms, and as long as they all have purpose, they shouldn't be pitted against each other as one being more important than the other." That sentiment couldn't have been further from Wynton's view, and the tension between them only grew as the conversation continued. One exchange in particular really caught people's attention. Wynton laid out his take on pop music's primary goal. "The purpose of pop music is to sell records that appeal to people on a level they want to accept it on. If you put out a record and it doesn't sell, then your next response is, let's try and do this or that to make it sell." At this point, even the interviewer couldn't help but step in. "That's terribly condescending towards pop," they said. Herbie didn't miss a beat. "Why are we asking him about pop music?" he said with a grin. "What does he know about pop music?" Wynton wasn't about to let that slide. "I know a lot about pop music," he fired back. Herbie wasn't convinced. "No, you don't," he replied bluntly. "You think you know." The room must have been electric at that moment. Next up is Stanley Crouch. Now, Crouch wasn't a musician. He was a jazz critic, cultural commentator, and one of Wynton's staunchest allies back in the day. In the 1980s and 90s, they were a formidable duo, championing the neo-traditionalist movement in jazz.
Joining us now is one of the most popular of these young lions, trumpeter Wynton Marsalis, who is also artistic director of jazz at Lincoln Center. Stanley Crouch, a jazz critic and commentator and author of Notes of a Hanging Judge.
Crouch wrote endlessly about Wynton's talent and shared his belief in the importance of keeping jazz's traditions alive. Together, they pushed back against the rising tide of fusion, free jazz, and other experimental trends that they felt diluted the genre. But even the strongest alliances don't last forever. At some point, their tight-knit relationship unraveled. Crouch, never one to hold back his opinions, turned his sharp tongue on Wynton. He began criticizing him publicly, accusing him of being too controlling at jazz at Lincoln Center, the institution Wynton had worked tirelessly to build into a beacon for jazz. Crouch also argued that Wynton's commitment to traditional jazz had crossed the line into dogma, stifling the genre rather than preserving it. Wynton, who is usually quick with a comeback, remained surprisingly quiet about the falling out. Insiders, though, say it wasn't easy for him. Crouch had been one of his earliest supporters, someone who had gone to bat for him time and time again. Their falling out wasn't just professional, it was personal, and the sting of that betrayal was hard to ignore. Now moving on to Keith Jarrett, a piano virtuoso and one of the most revered figures in jazz. Jarrett is a traditionalist in his own right, but his brand of purism doesn't align with Wynton's. Jarrett's focus has always been on acoustic jazz, and he's known for his disdain for fusion and other hybrid genres. On paper, you'd think he and Wynton might get along, but their differences put them at odds. The drama started when Jarrett took a jab at jazz at Lincoln Center, criticizing it for treating jazz like a museum piece instead of presenting it as a vibrant, living art form. While Jarrett's comments were aimed at the institution, it was clear that Wynton, as its artistic director, was part of the target. Never one to let a critique slide, Wynton hit back, accusing Jarrett of being arrogant and dismissive of others' contributions to jazz. For Wynton, this wasn't just about defending jazz at Lincoln Center. It was about standing up for the principles he believed in. He saw Jarrett's comments as undermining the importance of honoring jazz's rich history and legacy. What makes their clash so intriguing is that, at their core, they were arguing for the same thing: respect for jazz as an art form. The problem was they couldn't agree on the how. Jarrett felt that jazz should constantly evolve and reflect the present, while Wynton believed the best way to move forward was to stay deeply connected to the past. And then there's Anthony Braxton, the maverick of this lineup. Braxton is a composer, multi-instrumentalist, and one of the most innovative figures in jazz.
I had always found myself the odd guy out because many of the things I was interested in were not universally.
If Wynton is the guardian of tradition, Braxton is the trailblazer, pushing the boundaries of what jazz can be. His work blends free jazz, classical music, and even avant-garde concepts, challenging listeners to rethink their understanding of the genre. Unsurprisingly, Wynton isn't a fan of free jazz. He's been vocal about his disdain for what he sees as chaotic, unstructured music that lacks melody and discipline. While he's never called out Braxton by name, his critiques of the avant-garde make it clear that Braxton's work isn't his cup of tea. Braxton, on the other hand, has taken shots at Wynton's traditionalist approach, accusing him of being too conservative and trying to gatekeep what counts as real jazz. For Braxton, jazz is a platform for limitless creativity, a space where the only rule is that there are no rules. Their conflict highlights one of jazz's oldest and most fundamental debates. Should the genre prioritize preserving its roots or breaking new ground? Wynton sees himself as a steward of jazz's legacy, someone who keeps the art form connected to its origins. Braxton, however, views jazz as a constantly evolving medium, meant to reflect the ever-changing world around it. But despite all the drama and feuds Wynton Marsalis has been caught up in over the years, there's no denying his place as a legend in the jazz world. His contributions to the art form are unmatched, and his impact speaks for itself. To date, his recordings have sold around 7 million copies globally, a huge achievement in a genre that isn't exactly topping the mainstream charts. He's toured across 30 countries and performed on every continent except Antarctica, bringing jazz to audiences far and wide. When it comes to awards and accolades, Wynton's list is long and impressive. He's a 9-time Grammy winner, and his influence spans both jazz and classical music. In fact, he's the only musician in history to win Grammy Awards in both genres in the same year, a testament to his versatility and skill. But perhaps his most groundbreaking accomplishment was winning the Pulitzer Prize for Music with his oratorio Blood on the Fields. This wasn't just a win for Wynton, it was a win for jazz as a whole. It marked the first time a jazz composition had ever earned the prestigious award, breaking new ground for the genre and solidifying its place in the world of high art. Beyond the awards and sales, Wynton's influence goes deeper. His work as the artistic director of jazz at Lincoln Center has been instrumental in keeping jazz alive and thriving for new generations. And while his opinions and style have sparked plenty of debates and rivalries, they've also inspired countless musicians and fans around the world.